Disclaimer. Hello there. Alrighty, so for this video, since Hasbro has basically had their burst generation concluded for a while now, I thought we would look at the main kind of altered systems that they've done since the Chizetsu system or Turbo and kind of see which tip system slash technically gimmick stadium was the best. Now keep in mind, the focus for this video will be like the Slingshock, which handled gimmick, Hypersphere, Speeds, etc., right? We're not looking at the overall Hasbro Stadium stuff, that'll be a separate video discussion, but mullabays.com, that is your plug, because we got Beyblade X, Beyblade Burst. It is an optional way to support the channel. I appreciate any support regardless. So let's now talk about just Slingshock. So I want to make sure to preface this by saying the general Hasbro stadiums I don't really like just because they kind of ignore proper KO. Like the pockets are way too small or non-existent at all, so like a win condition is not even really possible in that regard. So that's the part that we'll probably cover eventually in depth for why I don't like Hasbro stadiums for some of them, just for general design. I also want to make sure we're kind of clear here. I'm only covering the main stadium gimmicks, so no light ignite, no motor strike, none of that, just the main type of stadium they'll be kind of focusing on and how the performance tips interact with it and my thoughts on the performance tips. So Slingshock for the actual performance tip slash driver, essentially how this basically worked is that you would have a battle ring mode that would basically just be normal, and then after the Slingshock mode, that would basically allow you to use the stadium gimmick. Now the stadium gimmick is essentially you just go on like these turbo rails, you follow a path, and then you meet each other for impact. Now this concept was done infinitely better in Beyblade X because they know how to design the stadium. But aside from that little jab, which we'll get to in a moment, the issue with generally these drivers and performance tips is that a lot of them don't properly stay locked in the mode or at all. Which is a little bit concerning because they kind of, you know, banked on this kind of gimmick thing and it didn't really work out because, like, keep in mind that these bays were heavily modified from the original, a much cheaper version, so obviously they have to rely on gimmicks, something interesting to make people actually give a shit about these bays. So, yeah, kind of an L in that regard. I mean, in general with the stadiums, I feel the issue is, one, they can follow the pathway, which I think most of them can, but I think the issue is, I think sometimes the design of the path doesn't really work out, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like it might be a little too thin, sometimes they just get stuck, which happens quite a bit in a lot of battles. And there are these stupid designs of these fucking speed cradles they keep putting on there, which the idea of this cradle or whatever, this little section of the stadium, should be that they should be trying to ramp down generally, or they're trying to build up speed, which usually doesn't really work out. But I think overall, I think Slingshock, for at least the tips having the gimmicks, was pretty cool. The actual mode changing, meh. The actual interaction with the stadium, nah. I don't like Slingshock. I think good idea, done poorly. Now we move on to Hypersphere, where none of the tips actually have gimmicks, and most of them are just modified shapes of spheres, which do have great variety, surprisingly enough. Now, Hypersphere is pretty cool because the stadiums kind of have like these deep curves and kind of slopes to them. So they're essentially kind of bouncing around and have some pretty crazy and erratic movement. Now, while I can have the opinion that maybe if we're trying to think of the mainline GT system, kind of sucky, but if you kind of ignore that for a second, you put that in the back of your head, Hypersphere is probably the best execution of this type of stadium gimmick. And the reason why I think it works so well, regardless if this is like the stadium where it has like that giant kind of hill it goes through and kind of goes around, I think it's just that the best way to execute a stadium gimmick is where the battles have intensity. It's fun to use the bays, it's fun to use the bottom, it's great interactivity with the stadium. And I think to give respect to Hypersphere for what they did, it was a very excellent stadium design, and with the bottoms. I think it was done very, very well, and there's a lot of intelligence and thought for the design. So Even though Hypersphere, again, you know, the stadium KO is kind of whatever, in terms of how they interact with the stadium, really cool. The actual tips and design, like, they're all circles, not really, like, I mean, obviously they kind of vary, but nothing really that I care about that much, honestly. Like, you can maybe argue, maybe some of them could have some, like, crazy stamina or some shit, whatever, but moving on from there, so we basically kind of went kind of shit to kind of peak, and then after we're back to shit. Well, Speedstorm. So the general gimmick with Speedstorm is that essentially it's kind of similar to Turbo, except they kind of gave up through part of it. The idea is that basically the stadium has it where there are like these little speed ramp curdle thing, whatever. It's like this little kind of pit where they basically twirl around and build up speed to go back to the middle. Now, I think this was done okay. I think the issue with this gimmick is that it's more of an anime gimmick than it is overall in practice, because I think the general issue with these stadiums is the actual space you have, because I'm sure Hasbro is confined, probably, and limited to kind of like limited to kind of like the specific space, so the stadiums do have to be a certain size, which becomes a little bit of an issue, because I feel maybe if the stadium was modified in size, you can maybe see it a little bit more effectively. Essentially, all the performance tips are super tall just to make this work out, because they're essentially just destabilizing in a place to hit each other. It's okay, but I think it's honestly worse than Slingshock. Oh, and keep in mind, too, they did this thing where they're like variants where they have metal on them, and when they don't have. I think this was just to compensate for the fact that essentially by the time you got to Speedstorm, it was pretty fucking embarrassing. So they tried to find any way to give them weight and whatever, which honestly, you know, at the hype of launch was pretty interesting, but I think there are a lot of performance tips that are pretty solid we got out of a Speedstorm, but in terms of working with the stadium gimmick, no, it was an absolute failure, I would say. Worse than Slingshock, because I feel Slingshock there's more consistency, so we move on from there, and this is where they it's completely dog shit now. It's QuadDrive, because QuadDrive, the issue with here's the issue with QuadDrive, there's no connectivity. The tips, whatever modifications they did, doesn't do anything for the actual stadium gimmick, because like the first one, it's like, you go up like an escalator, I guess, which is an okay idea of a stadium, but I feel just how the tips are designed, there's no entertainment out of it. That's my problem. And the tips are modified where you can give them an attachment or take it off and they can change typings and whatever, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. I think it's kind of cringe. So you get to QuadStrike. By the way, QuadDrive is the worst one, so it's worse than Speedstorm. QuadStrike, still behind Turbo, because it's just a shittier version of Hypersphere. Essentially, they tried to mock the idea of Hypersphere, because I think they realized that Hypersphere was their best idea. And most of the tips are kind of like this giant sphere kind of shape, but then they tried to like not do that, and then they don't really interact with the stadium all too well. And the Thunder Edge Stadium is essentially, like, I'll be honest, it's kind of, you just release that in Hypersphere and they probably work okay for Hypersphere base, but in general, tip system design and stadium design, nah. This is also the part where I mentioned quickly the bucket stadiums. That's what I call, I don't know if they have actual names, or the basic one. They're all shit, all of them. I understand this is my mini rant. I understand the idea of making a cost-effective stadium, but let's be honest, if Takara Tomy can do it where they can release the same stadium separately as the stadium from the set, not talking about the big gimmick ones, I wish we could have got that similar to Hasbro stuff, because all the bucket stadiums are like this confined square shape. The pockets are all bad on all of them. And they're just like the worst experience for like the tip gimmick that they're trying to do. But aside from that, I feel the issue probably is that the amount of time you probably need to perfect a gimmick, you need a lot of time, or you need really smart people. And if you look at Beyblade X, how many years they had probably to like refine a system like that, it makes sense why the bays work so effectively with that stadium gimmick. So I still want to give credit to Hasbro in terms of the mainline stadium kind of gimmicky stuff that they did. Hypersphere is pretty cool. And I think in general, they had cool ideas, but I think either limitations by the stadium or just not good tip design is what held it back a lot. Because if hypothetically we could have had it where every single one was like Hypersphere, where it was really fun, really exciting, good stadium design, whatever, then even though Hasbro did a lot of shitty changes to the bays, you could at least have one positive thing to reflect back on looking back. Because we're at the end and we're like, I guess Hypersphere is pretty cool. And again, we gotta give respect to Hypersphere for whatever maybe things you may disagree on. Again, I think that deserves a lot of respect, and I think this video may surprise people that I'm giving credit to Hasbro for some of the past changes or whatever, even though I've done that before. But I thought a full dedicated video would be super fun. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on some of the past stadiums, and let me know any memories you had or any cool stuff you tried out with these stadiums. And again, obviously we could look at maybe like the parts that came from these things and maybe some competitive value, yada yada yada, but I'm just trying to focus on this one aspect. Kind of. I don't know. I'm a little bit scatterbrained, I guess. But that's where we're going to be ending off the video. I want to say take care, have an amazing day, and bye!